He had no name, no rights, no freedom. And yet when the emperor of Rome couldn't sleep, he reached for this man's words. His real name was erased at birth. His master called him property. History calls him one of the greatest minds who ever lived. The word Epictetus is not a name. In ancient Greek, it means acquired property. Someone bought him and branded him with their own language of ownership. We don't know what his mother called him. We don't know what name he gave himself in the quiet of his own thoughts. That erasure is where this story begins. Around 50 A.D. in Hierapolis, a city in what is now Western Turkey, a child was born into slavery. The Roman Empire stretched across the known world, and he was part of its machinery. The Roman Empire, at its height, held millions of enslaved people. They built its roads, managed its households, tutored its children. They were property protected by law as objects, not persons. At some point, the boy who would become known as Epictetus was transported to Rome. He entered the household of a man named Epaphroditus, one of the most powerful freedmen in the entire empire. Epaphroditus was no ordinary master. He had been a slave himself, born into slavery, then freed, then elevated to become Nero's personal secretary. He operated at the very center of imperial power. History records that Epaphroditus was also present at Nero's death in 68 AD, reportedly helping the emperor end his own life when the empire turned against him. This was the world young Epictetus moved through. And it was Epaphroditus who, according to sources including the World History Encyclopedia, allowed the enslaved Epictetus to study philosophy under Musonius Rufus, one of the most respected Stoic teachers in Rome. Musonius Rufus was a radical. He believed philosophy was not for the elite alone. It was for everyone. He accepted Epictetus into his circle while the man was still legally property. This is the first inversion in our story. A system built to suppress thought, slavery, accidentally created the conditions for one of the most radical thinkers in human history. Now we reach the darkest chapter of his life and the most disputed. Something happened to Epictetus's leg, something that left him lame for the rest of his life. Some ancient accounts suggest his master Epaphroditus deliberately broke his leg as an act of punishment or cruelty. Other sources point to rheumatism or illness. The historical record is genuinely divided. What the sources do agree on is this: Epictetus walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and that physical reality, that daily embodied limitation, may have sharpened the philosophy he was already building inside his mind. Because the core of Epictetus's philosophy, what would eventually shake the foundations of an empire, came down to a single distinction: what is in your control and what is not. He couldn't control his body. He couldn't control who owned him. He couldn't control the laws of Rome. But his mind, his judgments, his reactions, his will, those belonged entirely to him. That, he decided, was everything. At some point, the exact date is uncertain, Epictetus was freed. He was no longer property. He was a citizen with a name that still wasn't his own. But he was now free to teach. For approximately 25 years, Epictetus taught in Rome. His school attracted students from across the empire, wealthy Romans, soldiers, government officials, all sitting at the feet of a former slave. His teaching method was confrontational by design. He didn't lecture at students. He interrogated them. He asked them what they truly valued, what they truly feared, and then he dismantled the answer. He owned almost nothing. According to the Daily Stoic, one of his most prized possessions was a simple earthenware lamp. When thieves once stole an iron lamp he had owned, he replaced it with clay because iron invited theft and attachment invited suffering. That lamp is not just an anecdote, it is a philosophy made physical. Every object you own can be taken. Every status you hold can be stripped. Only the quality of your choices remains yours. Then came the emperor who feared ideas around 89 AD, Domitian, who ruled Rome from 81 to 96 AD, issued an edict banishing all philosophers from the city of Rome. Philosophers were dangerous. They asked questions about power, duty, virtue, questions that made comfortable men uncomfortable. Domitian had seen what ideas could do to an empire. Epictetus packed whatever he owned, which wasn't much, and left Rome. He traveled northwest to Nicopolis, a city in what is now northwestern Greece on the shore of the Ionian Sea. And here is the paradox that history keeps repeating. When Domitian tried to silence the philosophers by removing them from Rome, he scattered seeds across the empire. Epictetus landed in Nicopolis and built a school. His reputation didn't diminish with distance. It grew. Students traveled from across the Mediterranean to find him, to study under the lame philosopher who owned a clay lamp and asked uncomfortable questions. Among those who made the journey was a young man named Arian. He was Greek, educated, and destined for a career in Roman imperial service. He arrived at Epictetus's school in Nicopolis and sat down to listen. Arian took notes, meticulous, careful notes. He recorded not just the ideas, but the voice, the tone, the confrontational rhythm of Epictetus in dialogue. He called the collection the Discourses. This is why Epictetus never wrote philosophy in the traditional sense. He didn't compose books, he taught. He spoke. And another man caught his words before they could disappear into the Mediterranean air. Arian compiled what he recorded into 8 books of discourses. He also produced a shorter summary, the Enchiridion, meaning handbook, a condensed guide to Epictetus's core teachings. 8 books. That is what Arian recorded. But here's where the mystery deepens, and where history delivered one of its cruelest losses. Only 4 of those 8 books survive to the present day. The other 4 are gone. We don't know exactly when they were lost or how, or whether they contained ideas that would have changed everything we know about Stoicism. 4 lost books, gone from history. The Stoic philosophy that shaped Roman governance, that filtered through centuries to influence modern psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy. We only have half of it, and yet what survived was enough to reshape an empire. Because among those who eventually encountered Arian's notes was a young Roman named Marcus Annius Verus, who would later become Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. Marcus Aurelius references Epictetus multiple times in his Meditations, a private journal that was never meant to be read by anyone else. He wasn't performing Stoicism, he was using it to actually govern his mind. The connection between them was not direct. Marcus Aurelius never met Epictetus. Epictetus died around 135 AD, roughly when Marcus was a teenager. The ideas traveled through intermediaries, through teachers, through books. One of those intermediaries was Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher and Roman consul who became Marcus Aurelius's personal tutor. Marcus Aurelius credits Rusticus in his Meditations specifically for introducing him to Epictetus's Discourses. Think about that chain for a moment. A slave in Hierapolis, a student in Nicopolis, a tutor in Rome, an emperor on a campaign in Germania. One idea carried across 4 people, across 8 decades, across thousands of miles. This is what the researchers at the USC Dornsife confirm is still happening. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations sold roughly 100,000 copies in 2019, up from 12,000 in 2012, an 8-fold growth in annual sales. The ideas are still traveling. Every person who reads that book and finds meaning in it is sitting unknowingly at the end of a chain that begins with a nameless slave in a provincial Roman town who learned to think under the worst possible conditions. Let's go back to Nicopolis, because there's one more thing you need to know about the school Epictetus built and about the man himself in those final decades of his life. Epictetus lived simply. He had no grand estate, no wealth accumulated from decades of teaching. He adopted a child. Some sources suggest he took in an orphan to prevent the child being abandoned, and he lived with a woman, possibly a companion or housekeeper, in his later years. He practiced exactly what he taught. When students came seeking his wisdom, they found a man who had genuinely surrendered attachment to everything except the quality of his thinking. There was no gap between the philosophy and the life. He died around 135 AD. We don't know the exact date. We don't know where he was buried. The man who had no name in life left with no grave we can find. Even in death, the external markers were absent. But here is what did not disappear. Arian's notes survived. The Enchiridion survived. The 4 remaining books of the Discourses survived. And with them, the voice of a man who had been told his entire life that he was property. Now let's step inside those surviving ideas. Because this is where the story stops being historical and starts being personal. This is where Epictetus reaches through 2,000 years and lands directly in your life. The first principle, the one everything else is built on, is what scholars call the dichotomy of control. Epictetus divided all of human experience into two categories: things in our power and things not in our power. In our power, our opinions, our desires, our responses, our values, what we choose to pursue and what we choose to avoid. These are ours completely. Not in our power, our body, our reputation, our property, political outcomes. These are never truly ours. Most people spend most of their lives trying to control what cannot be controlled and neglecting the one thing that can be. Epictetus knew this personally, not as abstract theory but as daily reality. The second major thread in his philosophy is the idea of the will, what he called the prohairesis in Greek. This is the faculty of rational choice. It is, in his view, the only truly human thing about a person. For Epictetus, animals react to stimuli automatically. But humans have a gap, a space between what happens to them and how they respond. That gap is the prohairesis. That gap is the whole of human freedom. A master can chain your body. An emperor can banish you from Rome. A disease can cripple your leg. None of those things can enter that gap unless you let them. That was the philosophy Epictetus built in a slave's quarters in Nero's Rome. Now consider where we are right now. 2025, the world has changed almost beyond recognition since 50 AD, and yet the core problem Epictetus was solving has not changed at all. We live in an era of what you might call voluntary imprisonment. We chain ourselves to other people's opinions. We measure our value by metrics that change every hour. We hand the keys to our internal state to algorithms we don't understand. The chains are invisible now. But Epictetus, a man who knew what actual chains felt like, would probably recognize the pattern immediately. You are obsessing over things not in your power. You are neglecting the only thing that is. This is why the USC Dornsife research found what it found, that sales of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations grew 8-fold in 7 years. People aren't just buying a history book, they are buying the thing Epictetus built, a framework for reclaiming the only freedom that matters. But here is the thing that the motivational stoicism industry will never tell you. This philosophy was not built in a comfortable study by a man with leisure time and good options. It was built under duress, under coercion, under a broken body and a stolen name. Every quote you have seen about stoicism, about not controlling what happens, only how you respond, traces back through Marcus Aurelius, through Junius Rusticus, through Arrian's careful notes, to a man whose name was a word for property. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable intellectual journeys in recorded history. And it nearly didn't happen at all. Think about the near misses. If Epaphroditus had not allowed Epictetus to study under Musonius Rufus, there would have been no philosophy to teach. If Arrian had not taken notes, the Discourses would not exist. If Domitian had burned the right scrolls, all 8 books might be gone. And if Marcus Aurelius's private journal, a book he never intended anyone to read, had not survived the 16 centuries between his death and the printing press, we might never have known how deeply Epictetus mattered to the ruler of the known world. Survival is not guaranteed. Ideas are not permanent. The 4 lost books of the Discourses are proof of that. Everything we know about Epictetus is the residue of a chain of accidents and decisions made by people who chose to preserve something instead of letting it go. Now here is the question this story has been building toward, and it is not a rhetorical one. It is a real question that Epictetus would have asked you directly, without softening it. If everything external were stripped from you today, your job, your status, your social following, your property, what would remain? What is actually yours? What have you built inside that no one can reach? Epictetus had his answer before the question was even asked. His answer was the same whether he was in Nero's household, or Epaphroditus' service, or a stone school in Nicopolis, or exile on the Ionian coast. The most dangerous thing a slave in ancient Rome ever did was not to run. It was to think clearly, because clear thinking, once you have it, cannot be confiscated. It cannot be sold. It cannot be banished. Domitian tried. He banished the man. He couldn't banish the thought. And within a generation, the man Domitian exiled was being read by Domitian's successor's successor, Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful human being alive in the 2nd century AD. The most powerful man in Rome learned how to think from a man who owned nothing. Let that sentence sit for a moment, because it inverts every assumption our culture makes about power, status, and whose ideas are worth listening to. We obsess over credentials, over platform size, over how many people are listening. Epictetus had no credentials, no platform, no citizenship. He had something rarer, a mind that had been tested and had not flinched. There is a concept embedded in Stoic thought that Epictetus returned to constantly, the idea that difficulty is not an obstacle to the good life, it is often the condition that makes it possible. His leg may have been broken by a master who thought pain would produce compliance. Instead, it may have produced the very clarity of thought that outlasted the master's empire, and 18 centuries of subsequent history. We cannot verify whether the leg was broken deliberately or by disease. The historical sources, as we have noted, genuinely disagree. But here's what we can say with confidence. Epictetus walked with a limp and taught without apology for the better part of 40 years. And that itself is the philosophy made visible. He did not wait for a perfect body or a better situation or the right social conditions. He worked with the material he had been given and produced something that outlasted an empire. Let's talk about what is missing. Because the 4 lost books of the Discourses are not just a footnote. They are an open wound in the history of Stoic philosophy, and no one has ever properly investigated why that loss matters. We have 4 books of the Discourses. Arrian mentioned 8. That means roughly half of Epictetus's recorded teaching no longer exists. We don't know what was in those books. We don't know what questions they answered, what arguments they made, what ground they covered. The Enchiridion, the handbook, survives in full. That is Arrian's condensed summary, designed for practical use, and it is remarkable. But the full discourses, the unedited conversations, the lost arguments, those we can only imagine. The Greek fire investigation we did on this channel showed how easily ancient knowledge can vanish. Epictetus's missing books are the same pattern, a gap in the historical record that we cannot close, that we can only acknowledge and mourn. What we have is enough to build a philosophy on clearly, given that Marcus Aurelius built an entire reign on it. But the absence of those 4 books is a permanent reminder that even the most resilient ideas are vulnerable in physical form. Which brings us to one last detail that Epochal cannot pass without noting, because it is the kind of detail that seems small until you understand the context, and then it becomes everything. The earthenware lamp. When thieves stole his iron lamp, Epictetus replaced it with clay. The reason he gave was essentially this: don't own what you can't afford to lose. The clay lamp is not just an anecdote, it is the entire philosophy compressed into an object. A man who had been owned as property chose to own as little as possible, not out of poverty or despair, out of clarity. He understood perhaps better than anyone before or since that everything you cling to can be used to control you. What do you cling to that could be used to control you? Your social standing, your follower count, your need for a particular person's approval. Epictetus would not judge you for having those things. He would simply ask, what happens to you if they're taken? This is the living edge of Epictetus's philosophy. Not a historical curiosity, not a motivational poster, not a podcast bite. It is a precision instrument for examining your own attachment to what is not in your power. They could chain his body. They couldn't touch what was inside his mind. That is not a slogan for Epictetus. It was a tested hypothesis, tested under conditions most of us will never face, and never broken. He was born with no name. He died with no grave we can find. But between those 2 absences, he generated a force of thought that crossed centuries, crossed continents, and still right now has the power to reorganize how you see your own life. The question Epochal leaves you with is not a rhetorical one. It is the same question Epictetus asked every student who sat down in that open school in Nicopolis by the Ionian Sea. He didn't soften it. We won't either. What is actually in your power right now in this moment, today? And what are you pretending is in your power that isn't? Because the gap between those 2 lists is exactly where your suffering lives, and Epictetus built an exit from it. That exit is not comfortable. It doesn't require the right circumstances. It doesn't require a better job or a different body or more money. It requires exactly what Epictetus had in Nero's household in 60 AD, the decision to think clearly, starting now. If this investigation moved something in you, if the story of the man with no name made you look at your own change differently, the best thing you can do right now is hit subscribe, because Epochal is going to keep investigating the stories that built the world we live in. And leave a comment below with this. If everything external were stripped from you today, what is the one thing you know would still be yours? We genuinely want to know. Epictetus would have wanted to know. That question never gets old. He had no name, no rights, no freedom. His leg may have been broken by the man who owned him. He was exiled by an emperor. Half his recorded wisdom was lost to history, and yet across 2,000 years, here we are still listening.